And we're live. Welcome back to the Saving Democracy show. I'm Etienne Labelle, and if this is your first time, the Saving Democracy show's goal is to strengthen democracy through long-form analysis, civic discourse, debates, and investigative journalism, I guess specifically democracy watchdog journalism. And in today's show, we got lots to cover as usual. And we will be revealing a new infographic. Maybe I can turn to a list here. So we'll look at this exciting new, though potentially dark, infographic that looks at the health of Canada's 6 democratic vital organs. So mixing metaphors here a little bit. Excuse me. And then we'll go through an update on the Emergencies Act inquiry, where the broader message is still no evidence supporting the use of the Emergencies Act. Then we'll cover new Alberta's Premier, Danielle Smith, which she's saying really good things, but there might be some concerns, and so we'll cover that. And then another story of an Ottawa police detective, Helen Grus, suspended for investigating possible link between COVID vaccination and SID, sudden infant death syndrome, which is a pretty strange story, but it's an important one. And then we'll go through some more fan mail suggestions from fan mail that actually speaks or suggestions for Saving Democracy show that speaks to some of the topics in terms of the polarizing nature of politics these days, the toxic nature of politics, and again why that might be the case, and then how to deal with it. How to inform yourself without getting too depressed, I guess. And I guess that'll tie into how I stay positive, how I personally stay positive, and then maybe go over tips on how you can stay positive among or amid all of this negativity. And then possible bonus live piano while we listen in to the Emergencies Act public inquiry to lighten the mood, because it is heavy topics as usual, and I think we need to lighten the mood. And so we'll just jump right in. Another new feature is that I am now offering $50 to anyone who asks a thoughtful question during the live stream. They will be entered into a draw to win a $50 Amazon gift card, which will be picked monthly so that we can encourage more participation. Because again, I have many unique and informed perspectives, but I am only one fallible human. And if we get more participation, we get more constructive discussions, and we will be able to get closer to the truth sooner. So we'll get a better understanding of the truth, and we hopefully will arrive there a little bit sooner. And so please chime in. I'll be very generous with what I consider a thoughtful question. And spread the word. Again, if you enjoy the coverage, spread the word. Okay, jumping in. Drum roll, please. I can actually maybe hide the chat or not. Let's see. Okay. So here's the chart. State of health of Canadian democracy. All vital organs injured. And so we'll zoom in here But the broader picture is to try to distill our constitutional rights into the top six, most fundamental categories. Because of course, our beloved Constitution is, there's 34 sections, and it's all text. There's not enough logos. There's not enough icons. So I basically try to distill these 34 sections into the most basic 6, and this is what I came up with. And so you have, on the one hand, individual human rights, which are the most fundamental, and then you move to interpersonal and interspatial human rights. That might sound a bit weird, but the idea is that you start, at first, you need bodily autonomy. Bodily autonomy and having your health is the most fundamental, because without your bodily autonomy, without your health, you can't enjoy the other freedoms. And then the second, most important, I would argue, though again, this is debatable, is freedom of expression. So you have your healthy body, and with your healthy body, you can express yourself. And you have the freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and then expression in whatever form you want, like this live stream, maybe a sign, maybe speech, maybe a loudspeaker, maybe a PowerPoint presentation, and then freedom of speech. So freedom of expression being a more general category. Freedom of speech is using your voice, using your speech. Excuse me, if you have any left. And so I contend that bodily autonomy, which is personal autonomy, self-ownership of your own body, so bodily autonomy and freedom of expression and speech should be the two most protected, because from there springs the other fundamental freedoms, such as your legal and democratic rights, which is the right to participate in democratic process and to have one's voice heard in Parliament. Wow. And equality rights. And then we can move to interpersonal, because once you have your individual rights and you have a body, healthy body, well, then you can decide how you want to be social. So freedom of assembly, freedom of association, and religion, you can consider those as the freedom to be social. And freedom of association just means you can associate with anyone or any group in private, and then, of course, peaceful assembly in public. And then freedom of mobility, very self-explanatory, whether it's within and outside of Canada, interprovincially, internationally, freedom to live in any province. And then finally, life, liberty, and security, which is kind of a mixed bag of the right to not be subjected to cruel treatment, the right to avoid arbitrary detention, and the right to earn a livelihood. And so let me know what you think about this organization, but the idea here is to then review specific developments which seem or appear to contradict these fundamental freedoms, and then to argue that this is a bit more concerning, because it's like your body analogy, right? Maybe you have a bruised knee, you have a scraped hand, and you have a bleeding forehead, right? But your vital organs are still fine. Vital organs being your heart, your lungs, your brain. But in this case, if it's your vital organs that are compromised, and it appears that your kind of top 6 most important vital organs are injured or threatened or compromised, right? Then it's a bit more of a situation. It's a bit more of a serious situation, right? Than just having these really, really secondary organs or secondary minor bruises and injuries. And then, to make it worse, we'll review the broader international geopolitical context where these authoritarian flavored developments seem to be happening virtually in all other Western democracies. Okay, so again, and the other benefit of this chart, of organizing the chart this way, is to organize our topics in terms of our deep dives, because again, we need depth and breadth. And actually, for each of these stories, we need depth and breadth. And also what will help is that I am, actually I can really zoom in here. For some of these stories, so all these stories I've deemed the most important I'm tracking more closely these stories that relate to our most fundamental freedoms, because again, there's just too many stories. There's literally thousands and thousands of different current events and developments happening that we could cover, but we don't have the resources or time. So the solution is to focus on the most important stories, track them a bit more closely. In addition to the spontaneous, of course, we still have spontaneous commentary. I'll provide spontaneous coverage on current events in less depth. But for other stories even more important, I'm going to be engaging in active watchdog journalism. And that means, for example, in the bodily autonomy category, for example, as we reviewed last time, and we will talk about this again this time, in terms of serious problems with the COVID vaccine safety and efficacy evidence, this is an active story, an active journalism story, where my current action and next action. So for any, we only have 2 active stories, though we might have a third one in terms of healthcare, probing insufficient explanations for ongoing and worsening problems with healthcare, despite increasing investments. We'll have current action of what's the current status, what's our last action that we've taken into this active investigative journalism, and then what's the next action. And this helps you also look forward to what we will be doing, so that you then are incentivized to tune back in to see, okay, what did happen. And so, for instance, in this category, we and I did this last September 2021, I submitted evidence to Health Canada and about 30 MPs, relevant MPs, demanding answers to 3 crucial questions regarding COVID vaccine safety issues that I identified and that I got double-checked, triple-checked by other smart, careful people, and including independent scientists, engineers, and basically got no response, or just template response, like, "Whoa, yeah, we're looking into it, but we're not going to do anything," right? And so the next step will be sending them reminder emails, a maybe final reminder, and then the step will be to submit ethics violation complaints against Health Canada officials and all contacted MPs who did not investigate into these COVID vaccine safety issues. And then also to submit such evidence to the other elected officials at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels, which we didn't do, because again, we only sent it to 30 MPs. But now we're going to send it to all of them. And if they don't address, if they don't follow up substantively, then we will submit ethics violation complaints against each and every one of them. Because that's the formal process. That's how a democracy works. Any elected individual that has power over other individuals, they need to be held at a very high bar in terms of scrutinizing their decisions, because they're the ones in power. And we need to hold them to account. And if they don't, then you submit an ethics complaint. And if they don't investigate the ethics complaint, or if they rule that there is no ethics violation, like what happened in my science whistleblowing with 3 Canadian funding agencies, well, then you appeal. And then you can file an appeal, and you just go deeper and deeper. And again, with lawyers, this is the other actually positive news, is that we are joining forces with an actual lawyer and another independent journalist called Jason Lavigne, who has a law background, even though he's not a practicing lawyer. And then the plan is to get a human rights lawyer on board. And then as a group, we have more strength and can be more effective at really digging down and trying to get answers for these crucial questions, which right now the 2 active stories are: how come Health Canada does not seem to be responding to unambiguous, clear safety signals with COVID vaccines in general, but particularly with the younger individuals with the pericarditis and myocarditis, and then the mandatory COVID vaccination for employment and general participation in society is, in my opinion, the second biggest fire that needs to be put out. And so our current action for that will be to submit ethics violation complaints against Trudeau's government and officials at the Public Health Agency of Canada for Nuremberg violating mandatory COVID vaccines for employment. And again, prove us wrong, right? But and that's one of the topics of our deep dive today, right? Can anyone point out how this is not a violation of the Nuremberg Code and informed consent? Putting pressure, any kind of pressure or coercion to get a medical treatment is an ethics violation. And I know this from my ethics training during my PhD training, actually even undergrad training. So, I mean, this is, and if anything, you should be learning about this in high school. You learn about history, you learn about the Nuremberg Code. So again, if anyone can explain to us how this is not a Nuremberg violation, then that would make my day. Because again, I don't want to believe that our government is violating medical ethics principles that were designed specifically to avoid medical torture and medical harm in the future. So that's heavy stuff. But that's the update. So yesterday, actually joined Jason Leving's live stream coverage of the public inquiry into the Emergencies Act. And we will be doing another show. And actually he streamed today, but I'm still working on the technicals of trying to, more spam. Fuck. I'm still working on the technicals of how to join someone else's stream while I'm already live streaming. I think I need a second camera, which I have. I just need to set it up. Okay, I need to clear some spam again. If you bear with me. So that's exciting. So that's good news in terms of trying to join forces. Because again, I'm just one fallible human being. I have specific skills and experiences that make me well equipped to deal with our challenges. But I'm still only one fallible human being. And we will not be able to not be able to make much progress if we don't work together. And if anything, we will also discuss how we can organize a more scalable movement or scalable strategies to help people inform others, and at least just to meet. So one idea is like the complement section. What am I doing here? Sorry, the complement. Let's refresh this. Okay. So some of you may have heard about the compliment sandwich, where when you are giving criticism to someone, you start with a compliment, and then you give the criticism, the negative feedback, and then you end with another compliment. And so the idea here is similar. We need to reconnect with our social peers and organize more social events. But because people generally think, politics is so negative, and though again, this goes beyond politics. So this is such a common theme. Oh, I'm not interested in politics. Politics are toxic. But I would argue, these problems are way beyond politics. I mean, as you can tell from this graph, these are fundamental human rights. This actually goes beyond even Canada's constitution, right? We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is not a legally binding document in a specific country, but they're fully consistent. I mean, we could go through these 6 categories and we could map it onto the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These are human rights concerns. This, whether you're left or right or libertarian, doesn't matter. And so if you say you're not interested in this stuff, then you're not interested in humanity. You're not interested in humanity's future, whether you have children or grandchildren or not. And again, it's your own prerogative, and in a democracy you are allowed to do things. I mean, that is, I guess, the irony of freedom is that you have the freedom to not care about losing your freedoms. And you have the freedom to do things that harm you, right? You have the freedom to now even to do drugs that harm you. And I guess we'll talk about that. But so the idea would be to organize social events where you advertise as, we're just going to have a party, we're going to have a potluck. But then in the middle, you start with the fun of just dancing, live music. Then you do a brief presentation where you go over some of these developments and try to brainstorm solutions, have a discussion, debate, Q&A, and then go back to the party. And if enough people do this across Canada, then we should be able to rehabilitate our conversations and how humans have always, in Canada, Western democracies, we've always used civilized discussions to resolve our differences. So why would it be any different now? Why would it be any different under COVID? Right? And so that's the update, which is a positive update. And this Jason Leving, he's in Yellowhead riding, not too far from here, only about an hour. And so we will likely meet in person for even longer discussions in terms of trying to figure out how to join forces. So just to finish, we're not going to, just to finish the presentation of this new infographic. So in bodily autonomy, the other bullet point we are tracking is insufficient justifications for mandatory masking. Because masking is about bodily autonomy, and if there are specific justifiable reasons, then of course it could be justified, and we'll go through those issues in those debates. And for freedom of expression, we'll be going through freezing of bank accounts, of Freedom Convoy donors, insufficient justifications for invoking the Emergencies Act, of course, insufficient invalid justifications for new hate speech legislation, insufficient justifications for new social media regulation legislation such as government wanting to even regulate now independent journalists and live streams like this. And also Trudeau labeling COVID unvaccinated individuals as anti-science who are often racist and misogynistic. And he said this in French, probably to hide it a little bit. And I put it in freedom of expression category here because it does have a chilling effect, right? Because imagine being people like me, people who've dedicated their entire life almost at being a professional skeptic, being an independent thinker, careful independent thinker who actually has a background in science, and not just a background in science, but who's contributed to how to carefully evaluate the credibility of scientific evidence. And then you go on live TV on a Quebec TV show and label COVID unvaccinated individuals as anti-science. Excuse me, I'm not anti-science. Who are often racist and misogynistic, right? So imagine the chilling effect this has on people who might be on the fence, right? And now he's dividing society into good versus evil, and kind of making people question whether they should express their opinion, right? So if you were concerned about COVID vaccines, but you're unsure, and then you hear Trudeau say that, right? It has a chilling effect on free expression and free speech. And then for the legal democratic rights, Trudeau unwilling to listen to 6-7 million Canadians concerned about and or against COVID mandates. Again, we have the right to be heard in Parliament. We have the right to have one's voice heard in Parliament. And so how come Trudeau is unwilling to discuss with Freedom Convoy organizers, though was willing and able to discuss and meet with BLM, Black Lives Matter protesters in June 2020 against his own public health rules at the time, a stay-at-home order and avoid large social gatherings. Right? So it's a double whammy here, because he's not just evading his responsibility as the prime minister of a democracy, but has a double standard where he's against protests that criticize his government, but then of course he supports protests which are ideologically aligned with his position, which is this radical woke ideology, which we'll get into. But it's worse than that, actually. He will even claim to support democracy and support anti-government protests elsewhere. So in India, for example, he was supporting the crackdown on Indian farmers. And again, that's even worse. Like, you're being a hypocrite. You can't claim to care about democracy in India with Indian farmers protesting, but then not support your own citizens who are protesting against against his own government. And then freedom of assembly and religion. We have the developments, potentially injurious developments, insufficient justifications for restricting and prohibiting peaceful protests in cities across Canada against COVID measures during lockdowns. Insufficient justifications for ending the Freedom Convoy protests via invoking the Emergencies Act. Insufficient justifications for prohibiting religious ceremonies during lockdowns. And again, if it was just a specific freedom and it was only violated very briefly and it was actually justified, then this would be very different than having kind of these unjustified violations across the board, across these major, the most fundamental human rights categories. So freedom of mobility, we have insufficient justifications for prohibiting rail and air travel to COVID unvaccinated individuals, and that was inter-province, international. Actually, no, the inter-province goes down here. So this was before the COVID vaccines, insufficient justifications for prohibiting inter-province travel during some of the lockdowns. And there's a really heartbreaking case of a woman in Nova Scotia who was prevented from being with her dying mother and sued the government and lost. So we'll review that. And finally, life, liberty, and security. Insufficient justifications for closures during lockdowns, business closures, school closures, gyms, restaurants. Insufficient explanation for the ongoing and worsening problems with healthcare, despite increasing investments. So we're going to look at the data, whether and to what extent is there declines in quality of care over time. And the claim, and it appears definitely to be true, anecdotally, of longer emergency room wait times. And finally, insufficient justifications for new gun control legislation, and also unjustified use of this sneaky order in council to avoid parliamentary debate, which I didn't even know existed until this happened in May 2020. And so it's a way for governments to pass laws by bypassing debate in the House of Commons. And I didn't even know this existed. So those are the most important developments in terms of being these authoritarian flavored events that appear to violate these 6 most fundamental human rights categories, with again the first 2 being even more fundamental. Bodily autonomy and freedom of speech are the core, the fundamental rights, which allow you to enjoy all other ones. Because again, without health and without the ability to speak, then you can't really enjoy the participating in democracy, or you cannot enjoy being with others, associating with others, having social events. And you can't enjoy traveling and working, right? So let me know what you think about this new graph, and we'll use this graph. It'll be used basically every live stream, and I will update it as we go in terms of the active investigations, which are again submitting ethics violation complaints against Health Canada and all members of Parliament who are not acting on this, and then also submitting ethics violation complaints against Trudeau's government and officials at the Public Health Agency of Canada for implementing mandatory COVID vaccination for employment, or anyone that worked as contractors for the government. Okay, let's maybe now go to the Emergencies Act inquiry. We can log in, check up. We can check this one off the list. Let's see here. Where is it? Is it? Okay, we'll do it over here.
They were cooperative, and then ultimately that shifted, right?
That's correct.
And why were OPS officers not able to control the behaviors to make them comply with the traffic plan?
There was just the volume and them wanting to get to a specific point. The original people that arrived, and even on the Saturday, there was still a good percentage of them that complied. There was frustration between the two groups, which led to some disputes. And then, but again, our focus was keep intersections clear, keep emergency lanes open.
I think I'm almost at the end of my time, so I'll only ask maybe one more question. You indicated earlier in your testimony in relation to the shift in the level of cooperation and the footprint that then created as a result, sort of the unintended footprint. You indicated that there was an opportunity afterwards to shrink the footprint, but that did not occur. What did you mean by that?
So right after I said that when the first weekend was wrapping up on it,
so
Monday,
this appears
two-thirds that had left. We were holding the same footprint with not enough officers, and there was an opportunity to
be Russell Lucas, Ottawa Police Service.
Smaller footprint onto Wellington. There was an engagement with PLT working with the organizers. The request went through the chain of command. Organizers, the request went through them 1 inch.
Who did you understand that direction to have come?
Yeah, and that's Jessica Barrow, Ottawa Police Service lawyer.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you very much.
So it's their own lawyer examining their own.
A brief re-examination, Commissioner.
And you'll identify.
So generally the cross-examination are more interesting,
Yes,
meaning that it would be
Counsel. Inspector Lucas, in the context of
which would mean
planning,
the Freedom Convoy lawyers cross-examining.
whether Chief Slowly gave you the autonomy you needed as incident commander. Do you recall that question?
I do.
And
This person seems.
you answered, I think your answer began with "in the beginning." Do you recall giving that answer?
I do.
Why did you say "in the beginning"?
Because it started to change after the first weekend, and where we just had the question about shrinking the footprint was I knew there was
Why is he smiling so much?
political impact from that, and that's why, and it wasn't time sensitive, and that's why that consultation, what I thought was going to be a consultation piece, took place, but it turned out that I didn't have the
Who is
autonomy
this anyways?
to make that decision, and that was the first of a number of incidents where I realized I was more in just managing live operations.
And what areas of what
He
specific
seems,
areas of operations did you feel that you lost the autonomy to manage?
I mean, again, you don't want
There
to
was
judge
draw on our
people's
resources,
appearances and how they
There
sound,
was, again, and I appreciate the
but
numerous
something seems
demands
off.
on the police service as a whole, but in the Monday, Tuesday period.
So we'll turn this down. We'll go over the high-level summary. Again, is that it's just the same, a lot more of the same in terms of no hard evidence, no credible evidence that there was imminent violence or national security concerns or weapons. So basically no hard evidence for the justification of invoking the Emergencies Act. And just a lot of chaos. between the different groups of Ottawa Police and OPP and RCMP and Parliamentary Police and everyone just fighting and infighting. But one development which is kind of dark is that they are in these discussions, in these cross-examinations, they're actually discussing the idea that if they had had a centralized command center for police, that this could have helped them better deal with the situation. And this will relate to our questions of probing the different scenarios of, like, in 2 months at the end of this public inquiry, what are the different scenarios for if it is concluded that it was justified versus unjustified. And as a skeptic, I was trying to think of alternative. Again, as a critical thinker, you have to think of what are alternative explanations, what are other motives, what are other things potentially happening that could be good or bad. And so, of course, if... Yeah, this is cutting off. I'll just switch to this other one. So this one can be a bit inflammatory. So, of course, with the obvious one being if the inquiry... And again, it's very difficult to see how this could happen. There seems to be not a shred of credible evidence so far across day 8. But if they do conclude that it was justified, then that would be a new low, because it sets the bar even lower as to how the government, what criteria need to be met for the government to declare an emergency so severe that we need to invoke martial law. But now with this talk of a centralized command center, that's another potential liability here, is that they use the public inquiry as a very visible development to help justify this idea that they need even more power. And that there can be some centralized command center to help in future illegal protests. And of course, that is extremely dangerous and definitely would not fly in Alberta, where, again, we need the opposite of that. We need more decentralized solutions, decentralized power structures, where the power decisions or power-related decisions are made at the most local level possible, and only if you need to go beyond a local level do you go to that higher order power structure. Because okay, so he is a rookie lawyer, but he seems to have, I mean, again, I don't want to judge, but it seems like curious demeanor. But again, maybe he has social anxiety, maybe he has all kinds of other things. So we shouldn't judge. But so to finish about this command center idea, and it comes back to individual accountability. So anyone that has power over other individuals in terms of them, and I'm working on another infographic on this very point. That any individual who's making decisions that affect other people's lives, they need enhanced extra scrutiny to make sure that they're accountable to the people they're having decisions over. And that's, again, why we need to keep things as local as possible. So the local police should always try to deal with the situation first and foremost, because they have more accountability to the individuals who they're having power over, because they're local neighbors, they're local communities, right? And that's what you want, and that's what you need. Oh, and we'll talk about this in terms of our active journalism case of submitting evidence of COVID vaccine safety signal to local police station where you have a history. You have a 25, imagine you know a constable, you know a police chief at your local police station, and you've known him for 30 years and you have a good reputation. If you go to that police chief with your evidence, you'll be more likely to be taken seriously than if you just go to, like, some Toronto police and you don't have any reputation, you don't have any personal history, right? So we have to leverage our personal reputations and our personal history when we're trying to keep the government accountable or the police accountable. Does that make sense? If so, please ask a question, ask a follow-up question, clarification question maybe. Okay. Let's see. Might need a quick break here.
To use PLT to shrink that footprint, we would have reduced it to a smaller size. I wouldn't have needed all those officers all through the Byward Market and on Rideau Street, and I could have pivoted them into other proactive engagement activities in the downtown.
So the lost opportunity, you say, is because you could not use PLT? I'm just trying to understand what happened, what was the lost opportunity and what caused it?
So, and there, again, so when they had that first, again, this is the earliest days of the protest with Rideau Sussex. If they had the opportunity to bring them out of Rideau Sussex, it would have freed up that whole side of the canal. And the direction that came down was, we're not giving them 1 inch. So that's what we worked with. And then, again, so we're spread thin, and now the next few days, it's just about building a stabilization plan so that we're not burning our members out, and that getting enough rotation of food and things like that before we can get into the next phase of an operation.
Thank you. So that terminates your evidence, completes your evidence. Terminate sounds a little negative. So that completes your evidence. Thank you very much. So we're going to take the morning break. It's a little late, but I think it's still necessary. And when we come back, we'll go on to our next witness. So 15 minutes, please.
The commission is in recess for 15 minutes. La commission est levée pour 15 minutes.
Okay, look closely. So one thing I noticed yesterday or the day before.
All right. So what do you think? I thought that guy Micho, the person.
Okay, we can mute that. But I noticed another time that the judge, Rouleau, in the morning, he walked in to that room with a black face covering, a black mask. Because there was already contention as to his independence. Is he impartial? Sufficiently impartial? Is he sufficiently independent to be able to rule and give his recommendation, give his conclusion at the end of this? He needs to be independent. And of course, he has a set of ethics, code of conduct that he needs to follow. But there are charges, or not charges, but there is credible evidence that he did. Might have been a long time ago, but definitely briefly worked for the Liberal Party and had Liberal Party connections. And so again, why not have 2 judges? Why not have an independent panel? Why not have 5 judges that are randomly selected? There's so many other ways. So we could look into other boring details of how are these public inquiries set up, what are the standards, who's checking to see if this public inquiry actually meets the standards set out by the government in terms of how is a public inquiry supposed to be conducted so that it is valid and we actually have a fair inquiry that respects the Constitution and respects the rule of law. And that's not my area, but it would appear, even again, just from the commission, if you look at the commission members, it's really not that hard to say, oh, okay, basically establishment, elite people here. 40 years of experience, Canadian courts, complex business litigation. And you would expect, of course, they're trying to pick experts, professional experts that have training that's relevant. But you can also look at where do they get their university education. And just from scanning this list, it seems overrepresented with establishment folks and underrepresented by basically more blue collar, more working class type people. Alberta. And again, it'd be good to have more details of how are these people chosen, who do they consider that they didn't choose, and I can't find it. So if anyone knows where to find it, then that would be great. Yeah, you can share your views, contributions, questions to answer, public hearings, documents. So maybe they're here. Oh yeah, I did read some of these where they were debating the witnesses, and this is where they initially, for example, rejected Pat King and BJ Dichter. So there's all this boring stuff about how they decided, and it seemed very, very subjective. But so yeah, if anyone knows, I mean, there's the official, oh, I know where it would be. So the official document, yeah, and actually this is another order in council. So this is the official declaration that there would be an inquiry. So again, the Emergencies Act was declared February 14th. And until February 23rd, so a full week. So it gave the government authority to issue and apply temporary measures set on the Emergencies Measures Regulations and the Emergencies Economic Measures Order. Within 60 days, cause an inquiry to be held. Oh, here it goes. Inquiries Act. So directs that a commission do issue for the period ending on March under Part 1 of the Inquiries Act, and under the Great Seal of Canada, appointing the Honourable to be a commissioner to conduct an inquiry under the name of the Public Inquiry into the 2022 Public Order Emergency. So, yeah, you'd have to go read the Inquiries Act, and in that legislation, it would outline what are the requirements for conducting a valid, fair public inquiry. And it's going to be really boring, really long. But again, this stuff is important. In terms of making sure we have actually a valid, because this is momentous. So again, if they find ways to just bend the law here and not enforce the ethics there a little bit, they can really compromise democracy. Yeah, and even the way this is written, oh my. So again, direct the commissioner to examine issues to the extent relevant to the circumstances of the declaration and measures taken with respect to the impact, role, and sources of misinformation and disinformation, including the use of social media. But again, who decides what misinformation is, right? So this is already written in a very biased way, where the government claims that people who are concerned about medical ethics violation are spreading misinformation, when the government itself is the one spewing most of the misinformation in terms of these propaganda pieces during the Super Bowl that suggested if you have a Super Bowl party, you're going to kill grandma. I'm sorry, that's the misinformation. So it really, again, shows that without really completely unfettered freedom of speech and expression, you can go through all these official motions, but it's a cargo called democracy, just like cargo called science. It looks and smells like democracy, but at the end of the day, your fundamental freedoms are trampled on, and you don't get to live a free and democratic life. So, and we don't want to just have free expression, free speech. We want to incentivize it. We want to bribe people to be informed, bribe people, and even subsidize people to have professional debating leagues where they are rewarded for debating these issues, rather than just not rewarded, or like currently you're ashamed. Your family excludes you from events because you are trying to think critically. They shame you, they call you names, right? And so only crazy people like me have the courage to defend these principles and say, well, I'm going to do this anyways, even if no one's paying me and most people are ignoring me. Most people would just wish I would just go away because it's always so stressful, it's so negative, it's so toxic. Well, I'm sorry, but prove me wrong. Again, I don't want to believe that these things are actually happening in Canada, but they are. Okay, so that covers that. We'll come back, check up on that. Actually, I need a quick break. So when I come back, we'll do a deep dive into mandatory vaccines as a violation, serious violation of medical ethics. See you soon.
Mom, you sound like a white supremacist. I hate to say it.
Yes, what is her premise? What is the part that she knows about education?
No, I'm saying you sound like a white supremacist right now.
What the answer is, and you're just spitting stuff out. That was a true statement. He was kind of bragging about the OPS and how they were being very civil with the detainees and providing them some hand warmers while they were freezing. And then we got into do you agree that hypothermia, frostbite, and we listed off a whole bunch of other things is a safety risk for people? And of course, the witness had to agree there is a risk. Yep. Sure, of course. You're also talking about getting rid of their fires and stuff like that. Wayne, I just got a couple more notes and then we'll move on to you. Did you not see any of the plans? So she then started talking about whether or not he had access to the plans, and he started to backpedal again. His focus was on getting our officers through the next 3 hours. So, really thinking about just his job, compartmentalized, not caring about what the rest of the plans are and what other people are doing. I think that was embarrassing. I think his career should take some sort of re-education. He's got the wrong mindset for that job. Sure, you're supposed to be dedicated and focused to your job, but what you shouldn't do is ignore how other pieces of the team's working, especially if you're allowing them to proceed in a way that's illegal, and you're going to later find yourself in an inquiry explaining it. Have another note here. The police drove protesters outside the city without phone or shelter. He answered he didn't know, like as if he didn't know about that. We've actually had plenty of testimony. Well, a little bit of testimony so far. We're going to get a lot more coming out next week, I'm sure. But we've had lots of video and lots of witnesses to this. They would pick up people, drive them out of the city, take away their phone, drop them off wherever they are, and then just say, go, don't come back type of thing. Young people, young adults, teenagers, just basically anybody. And why are they doing that with no charges? Because there are no charges. This is legal. This is just a way of transporting the ones that are in the front that are resisting. And then when asked again, right, so she had to kind of repeat it and asked again, and pointed to a statement that he made where he replied, well, they'll find a way to leave, implying after we drop them off, they'll find a way to go from that location to something else and then maybe not come back to the protest itself. So he was very aware that they were doing that. And that's sad. He was a flip-flopper. He did tell the truth in certain places. He named names, and he definitely painted a really bad picture. There's a lot more from this first half. I got a whole bunch of notes. I do want to let you know we have guests lined up for this break as well. I'm going to bring back Joe and Chris, and we're going to get into a lot more conversation about Alberta, sovereignty, BC, and where we're headed with that. And I'm sure Joe and Chris will have a lot more to talk about as well. So stick around for the lunch break on that. And Wayne, welcome back, my friend. You are really loved on Twitter. You are really loved by quite a few people. Your video was taken down. Our video was taken down. Still up on Rumble, and now there's a lot of people sharing it, pushing it, and you're a good dude, and you do have a lot of support. What do you think?
It's all thanks to you as well, though, because it's your platform, and you're willing to take the risk to talk to people. So, unfortunately, those words do trigger off the algorithms. So.
Yeah, no, there was only 18 viewers, 5 likes at the time it got taken down. YouTube does not tell you anything about why they did it. They just said you violated medical misinformation and COVID vaccine. That's all they told me. Yeah, they didn't tell me where or anything like that. So even if we wanted to censor you on YouTube, we can't, because we don't know what part it was that was a problem for them.
Could be any of it, couldn't it? It could even be the name, because you're banned then on Twitter. So you then somewhere might be tagged somewhere else.
Yeah, and I think what's going on is either AI that saw the vaccine injury in the name and just kind of tagged it, or there's some people with a special dislike button, and they just hit it and immediately you're off, and then you can go to appeal.
Yeah, keyboard warriors.
Yeah. But no, I did an appeal. So someone, they're going to have to watch 2.5 hours to see if we crossed the line. I believe they're going to have to watch the entire thing because they're not going to find anything along the way. And we're probably going to get a like and put back up from them because it was a good video. It was fair.
I
And
mean, that's what so many people are saying, you know, because it was such a broad range of topics. But it was just natural conversation that just seemed to come up. So
yeah, and your personal experience is not subject to medical misinformation because it is your personal experience. If you were saying things like, "I believe all people should do blah," and I'm going to be very careful how I speak here because the AI might listen to that and misinterpret it, then yeah, I could understand why, because you're directing or informing people about something. That I could see would, yeah, and I could see how someone could challenge that kind of statement as mis or disinformation, as we have had defined during this inquiry. But you didn't do that. You only talked about what you went through, your experience, firsthand witness,
I can't
and
remember fully, but I might have said, even as a disclaimer,
careful.
I'm not telling you. I'm not telling you to do one thing one way or the other, but
Yeah.
just please be better informed. You know.
Yeah, no, and I think even at one point, something along the lines of we we respected the fact that there's certainly a group of people who would benefit from the vaccine, and the older group, the people with pre-existing anything. There's certainly a group that some of the data has been showing does benefit, and that's about as far as we went with that because well, we don't want it taken down. But yeah, we got bit by the censorship bug. I'm appealing it. Someone's got to watch it now, and I suspect we'll get it back up. But in the meantime, hello Rumble.
Yeah.
Not a problem there.
Really.
Yeah, no, they marked it as monetized. I don't make any money. It's very very low
No,
traffic
at
and
the end
stuff.
of the day, it's a bonus. It's a bonus to the whole thing, isn't it? Because you're
Yeah.
getting your stories out there, whether it's myself or the other people that you talk to. You know.
Yeah, and I have a huge concern though because Rumble has definitely become the alternate platform, which a lot of people are using, which is great. However, it's a Canadian company. It's based out of
Oh.
Toronto, and it will be subject to Bill C-11. I assure you that Rumble is one of the drivers behind the Bill C-11 because they are absolutely staying open, free, and they're not violating any laws. Because if they were, that's a different question. But they're not following censorship and control or narrative. So they're a problem. Sorry, I see we may have video. Nope, sorry, not yet. It's Maverick doing a great job doing some clips and reviewing some stuff. It looks like.
Oh, so you had to switch feeds or something? Because I just
Yeah, no, hold on. Let me check because I want to make sure I'm right about that.
It's your direct connection to the creator, and you hold it in the spirit of the truth.
Oh no, it's a new witness. Here we go.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Good
folks.
afternoon, Inspector. Just to clarify, you pronounce your last name Bowden, not Baudet?
Bowden.
Bowden. Okay, good to know. Can you tell us your current rank with the OPP?
Currently the acting superintendent in the Indigenous Policing Bureau.
And was that the same rank that you held in January and February of this year?
It was not. I'm doing a temporary assignment right now, and we'll be back to an inspector shortly, I'm sure.
Okay, what was your rank in January and February?
Inspector.
Okay. And I'm showing you, or I'd like to pull up your witness statement, WTS 6037. You recall sitting for an interview with myself and my colleagues this summer.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and you reviewed this interview summary, a draft of this interview summary when it was prepared.
Yes, I did.
Okay, and the contents of that summary are accurate?
Yes, they are.
Do you have any corrections or changes or additions to make to it?
No, they're all good. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Can you just briefly describe for us your background and your role at the OPP?
As far as my role in policing right now, or?
Correct.
Okay, so my role in policing right now is the acting bureau commander for the Indigenous Policing Bureau, which oversees 4 areas. So those areas involve the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls implementation team, the Ontario First Nations Policing Agreement, which oversees.
Okay, I'm back.
Services.
I think we need some light-heartedness. So I'm gonna play a bit of piano
We will be
while listening to this cluster.
I'd like to show you a document.
Pardon my
If
French.
we could pull up OPP 4045.
And what you were watching before
This is the OPP's framework for police.
is Jason Leving,
Indigenous
the independent
critical
journalist.
incidents.
I only
Can you tell us
cut
what this document is?
the end of it.
Yeah, this
But
is one of 19 critical
sounds like
policies for the
he's
OPP.
been
and it ultimately
targeted
works through
by YouTube
conflict
for
cycle,
medical
when it comes
misinformation
to indigenous
violation, which
critical incidents or
again is
non-indigenous related conflict-based
completely ridiculous.
conflicts.
And so when and
Given
why
that
was
it's
this
the opposite.
policy created?
And actually, one of my videos last fall
Policy was created
also was
as a result
targeted,
of IPPO
and I
laws.
appealed it and won.
In
But
1995,
again, that's
obviously there was the
it's just an
shooting
uphill
at
battle that you're not going to
George
win.
in a provincial park, and obviously lessons learned there was communication strategies, mediate the
So let's.
importance
It's
of
hard to know the level.
mediators for people that could
So let me know.
liaison, or people with influence that would have influence on outcomes, as well as correcting misinformation. Is
Oh, I'll
probably
turn off my
the
microphone.
for us, obviously, it didn't necessarily start the PLT, but it definitely contributed to the part of the Aboriginal Relations Team program.
And I think you mentioned that this is one of 19 critical policies. Can you tell us what is a critical policy and why is this one of 19 of them?
Yeah, so it's interesting when you talk about police language, right? Because sometimes people will say, oh, like, this is critical. And to me, that's bad as far as a community member. But when it comes to policing, critical to me means it's of high priority, it's something that we take very serious, and it has tremendous ramifications if it's not followed.
And I think there's 19 of them out of how many policies across the OPP?
I'm not certain.
But are critical policies a sort of subset of
Yes.
sort of important policies? Does that mean that every OPP officer is sort of aware of them and required to sort of read them and know them?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
If we go down to pages 5, starting at page 5, the policy is divided into 3 stages, or refers to sort of 3 stages: pre-critical incident stage, critical incident, and post-critical incident. So I'm wondering if you can, for a few minutes, just explain what each of those stages are.
Yeah, so when you look at pre-critical, right? So you have an analyst, or I think we've heard from intelligence talking about, okay, this is a potential conflict that's coming up, right? So the number one predictor of conflict is real or perceived inequality. So that's something that we look for, right? And when you look at the province of Ontario right now, you have potentially, roughly 50 land claims up for negotiation. And sometimes I remember Inspector Morris saying it's interesting that PLT sits within IPP, but or Indigenous Policing Bureau, sorry. But the reality is it's extremely important for us to have relationships with Indigenous communities as a result of the number one predictor of conflict. And so in that, what our job is, and what the PLT member's job is to when we see that there's going to be potential conflict, our job is to reach out, build relationships. And by relationships, sometimes people just say the word relationship and they don't necessarily break that down. But to us, it actually means something. Like, it means something to build a relationship.
Yeah, build a relationship, like talking to Freedom Convoy protesters. Why don't you build some relationships there?
Recognize the person
And
knows
start a
my
relationship
best
by
English.
having conversations.
I'm competent. I'm able to.
What a
do it,
joke.
and ultimately, I do what I say I would like to do, right? And so we build relationships, and then we also get into agreements or ideas of what the protest, demonstration, occupation may look like. So we have those, not verbal contracts, but pretty much, right? Like, okay, so this is the law. This is what you should avoid doing. This is some alternative options to ensure that it's lawful, peaceful, and safe. And then if there's any deviation from that, here's the potential consequences associated to that. And the reason that we have those upfront conversations is because typically emotions and intelligence run together. So if someone's emotional in times of crisis, typically intelligence gets low. So when there's no emotion involved, ultimately it's a great opportunity for us to have conversations that are meaningful and to understand what the objective is, what people are trying to achieve, and how we can facilitate that lawfully, peacefully, safely.
Okay, and so
And so that would be pre.
right,
And then
that falls into pre-critical.
yeah, for sure. And then during critical, so ultimately when protests are happening, I think during the Freedom Convoy, the OPP PLT took part in, I believe, from January to February, 222 protests provincially. So when protests are happening, we're trying to ensure that they're lawful, peaceful, safe. And so our job is to make sure that we are having open and transparent lines of communication with people to ensure that they know that they can be trusted with what we're saying, and they can trust what we're saying to be true. And then ultimately working through to ensure if someone's doing something that's not lawful, peaceful, or safe, obviously we have to have some sort of police intervention, and we would try and facilitate one that is lawful, peaceful, safe. So ultimately, if they're on the roadway, hey, off the roadway, right? This is a bad spot.
Okay, so the third stage for the poster implies that stage. What
Yeah,
is
that's ultimately what I think we're doing here, right? Like we're debriefing, we're trying to learn best practices, we're trying to understand what went well, what didn't go well, deconflict areas and perceptions that may be different, and then just discuss it. Take lessons learned from those and try and do better next time, and then also restore, rebuild relationships. Sometimes we have people that don't necessarily get along, and it seems interesting that the police would be such a contributing factor to that, but that's what we're called for, is for safety. So in there, we would basically try and create a strategy for them to be able to demonstrate, recognizing the intersections where they may be stepping on.
If I could pull up call 50666. What I have on screen is the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police's National Framework for Policing Awareness for Demonstrations and Assemblies. So to start, if you could just tell us how this document relates to the previous framework that we were just talking about.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities, obviously. So when this was created, it came from the Policing Awareness the way things were kind of growing when it came to demolitions on a global scale internationally, and then within North America, now in Canada, quite frequently, right? I think you look at the numbers associated to provincial liaison team in 2012 compared to 2022, and they're tremendously higher as far as the OPs are able to. You can only imagine that that would be reflected with other police forces.
And if we could go down to page 5 to 6, there's some
escalate and we're no longer able to communicate, then obviously there's tactical responses.
All right, hopefully you enjoyed that.
And it's kind of on a floating scale, right? Like, so it's not like, okay, negotiations are here.
Little nourishment for your soul. Again, music has different impacts for different people, but for most, gives you a flame of hope.
So when it comes to relationship building, we talk about trust between police and citizens.
This is hard, really hard to listen to.
Right? And so we look at a few things. So respect, right? Rapport, reciprocity, trust.
Relationship building. Again, how can they stand there and talk about that when they clearly violated that to the grossest extent? Where nobody wants to talk. To people who are not just defending their own rights, they're defending the rights of everyone. And actually this speaks to a question, and we might as well address it right now. It's a common question that caring about your individual rights is selfish. That's a question or a claim or a statement. And it couldn't be further from the truth, because again, fundamental human rights are applicable to everyone. Even the people who are against it. More spam, God. Oh, excuse me. Right? And so if someone accuses you of being selfish for trying to defend your individual human rights, your response should be, excuse me, it's actually the opposite. I'm sticking my neck out. I'm taking professional, legal, and financial risks to not just defend my rights and my family's rights. I'm actually defending your right to disagree with me. Right? And that's the irony of that. Sometimes there were counter protesters at freedom related protests, and I was trying to explain that to people, saying, well, you realize that you're arguing for a position that's self-defeating, because that's the thing. Even if you support the Emergency Act, or even if you supported the government's draconian, unprecedented COVID measures, you have the right to agree with the government, but it's also possible in the near future that you would no longer be in agreement with the government, right? And so again, you have to think about more fundamental principles rather than just personally, right now in my personal situation, is this good or bad for me? Right? It's a logical fallacy. You have to look at the more fundamental principles, like these ones. And this was a common theme early in the COVID lockdowns. I had really smart friends say, well, yeah, you're probably right. 2 weeks flattened curve was insufficiently justified. But it doesn't really affect me. I was going to renovate my basement anyways, right? So yeah, humans are good at adapting to situations. But if fundamental principles are being violated, particularly medical ethics principles, then you have to push back. And that's what I did in science for a decade, and we had small victories, but again, the impact was just not large enough relative to the costs and the effort. And so yeah, caring about fundamental human rights is not selfish. It's actually the opposite. It's selfless. But it's still a selfish selflessness, if that makes any sense. Okay, we can check that one off. And actually, maybe we can answer a few other questions before jumping into the deep dive. And I still haven't dealt with these spam messages, which are so annoying. Okay, let's see. How do I delete report? Oh, maybe I need to do it in restream as well. There. Settings. Please bear with me here. I don't think I can delete them here. Wow. Okay, we'll try to figure out a better solution for these annoying spam messages. Okay, there you go. So, what if the inquiry concludes the Emergencies Act was unjustified, right? Which would appear to be the correct decision. Would the government resign? Would Trudeau resign? Would they get in trouble? Well, I think it would be justified again because we have due process. So no matter how guilty Trudeau might seem, he still has due process and what's called presumed innocence. And so, to me, in the event the judge rules that the Emergencies Act was unjustified, then there should be actually just another investigation into the some kind of ethics violation or some kind of corrective action. Because again, if there's no, it's a feedback loop. You have to think of politicians in terms of what is driving their behavior to actually do their job and to do their job to the best of their abilities. And in general, you either have rewards or punishment. You know, in the free market and in the free market dynamics, and this is what most corporations do, rewards and like parenting and raising your child, rewards typically work better than punishments. But you generally need to use both. But how come with politicians, if they do a good job, they don't really get bonus pay or bonus rewards? And if they do a bad job, they don't seem to get punishment. I mean, only in rare circumstances. But as we know with Trudeau, he's up to, what now, 5 ethics violation? And instead of getting in trouble, he just fires integrity commissioners and somehow just keeps going, right? So that's another part of bulletproofing democracy, is that we need stronger rewards for politicians who actually do good work and actually enforce or implement public policies that do benefit and serve the interests of Canadians, or at least, again, benefit more than harm, because it's going to be hard to please everyone. But you have to at least ensure that you're not violating medical ethics, you're not violating basic Enlightenment values, you're not violating the law, the rule of law, whether it's federal law, provincial law, municipal law. But then we also need more major punishments and better enforcement. So we just need more independence between the judicial branch and the executive branch, more fireproofing, where integrity commissioners that will investigate elected officials' behaviors, they need to be more independent and more fireproofed from those people. And specifically the SNC-Lavalin, I believe, was the scandal where Trudeau somehow was able to demote the integrity commissioner, right? That should never be even possible. And then, as we already covered, what if the inquiry concludes the Emergencies Act was justified? Well, then that's a new low for democracy, because it would set the bar even lower to the criteria that need to be present for the government to declare an emergency and therefore invoke wartime measures that gives them even more power, right? And as we saw with COVID, they already have too much power and they're overreaching, and now they want potentially more power, and now they're talking about centralized command center for the police. Well, again, it should be the opposite. And so if they do conclude that the invocation of the Emergencies Act was justified, then there, and this would be in the, I guess, Inquiry Act. We'd have to look at the Inquiry Act and see what kind of appeals, what kind of processes are in place to appeal the decision of the inquiry. And you would have grounds in terms of what we've covered so far. You could go the route of the judge is not sufficiently impartial, the panel is not representative, the witness list is cherry-picked and or insufficiently representative, and any other violations in the conduct of the inquiry. So you could have an appeal, and then if your appeal is not granted, then you can file an ethics complaint. And excuse me. So that's the different scenarios of thinking, trying to think ahead here. And there's even other possibilities where they could declare an emergency before they could declare another Emergencies Act right before the conclusion of the Emergencies Act inquiry. Kind of what they did during the Emergencies Act. So during the Emergencies Act, the protocol and the safeguard that does exist is that the Senate was debating the appropriateness of using the Emergencies Act, and they were about to vote. And so there's talks that the only reason Trudeau ended the Emergencies Act after 7 days was because the Senate was about to vote, and it appeared based on, and we could try to find, this would be interesting, try to find some of this video coverage of the Senate debating the Emergencies Act during that critical week in February 14th. To hear the arguments, because the Senate is more balanced in terms of older conservatives, right? And so it's possible that Trudeau was forced to repeal the Emergencies Act before the Senate was going to vote it down, which would have been more damning and more embarrassing for him. And so it's possible that something like that might happen again if, again, the evidence just seems overwhelmingly to support the idea that the Emergencies Act was not justified. But it just seems unfathomable that this, what seems to be a biased inquiry, would actually conclude that it was unjustified. Right? So, so you have to try to think outside the box of, well, what else could they do to avoid accountability? Because they've avoided accountability for more than 2 years. And again, miracles do happen. And we do need to stay hopeful. And maybe this is a good place to talk about what keeps me hopeful despite all of this negativity. And one, of course, is having a family and having future generations that will inherit our democracy. And just like Jason Lavigne, the independent journalist, he has a young family as well, and he's fighting for his children's, fighting so that his children can have the childhood and the free childhood that he enjoyed. And beyond that, there's the idea that like, I need to do this. I mean, I would talk about this even if I wasn't live streaming. And so perhaps it's my calling to use my skills, my special, unique background, to try to organize all this information. And even if it seems unlikely that I'll have any significant impact, it's still my calling, and it's my way to turn chaos into order. The other positive, I guess, that keeps me going is that in general, history has shown that most of these battles are between good and evil, but that in general, good spirits generally win against evil spirits because it's just more natural. So this gets into the deep psychology and the potential for humans to commit atrocities. Of course, the Nazis and even social psychology, the power of the situation, obedience experiments, conformity experiments, the classic social psychology experiments show us that the environment that people find themselves in can make good people do bad things. But, and I guess I'll have some religious-oriented people disagree with me here, but I truly believe that most people have a good spirit. Most people have the best intentions, and they're trying their best to be a good person and a moral person, and that it's the situation that leads them astray into darker paths. But there are natural, I guess, psychopaths, narcissists, but they're very rare, right? We could look at that too. The rates of psychopathy and the dark triad, which is psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, which tend to be overrepresented in academia, corporate, and the political sphere, these high status jobs. And again, this is why we need these safeguards, environmental safeguards, because we know whether or not people are naturally, intrinsically good people, we know that toxic environments will corrupt people. And so the solution is not just to hope that people will do the right thing. The solution is to change the environmental structures, the environmental constraints, so that it is harder to do the evil things. It's harder to make it harder to be a bad person, and reward the positive behaviors. And whether we're talking about politics or science or even corporate fraud and investment fraud, just make it harder for people to break the law by making it easier to catch them. And that's generally transparency and accountability strategies, which will be covered in our Bulletproofing Democracy book. And again, maybe there's other strategies, but that's the basic strategy is with the wrong incentives, people will be convinced to do evil things, can be convinced to do evil things. So we need to switch around the incentives and switch around the environmental constraints that these politicians are operating in, so that they're more likely to do the right thing in terms of serving the interests of the people and respecting human rights, rather than doing wrong things just to serve their own ego, to serve their own career, to serve their political lobby groups, to serve the corporate interests, the mega corporations, and on and on and on, right? Okay, what's next? And again, please let me know if you have questions, clarifying questions. We have a $50 Amazon gift card to try to encourage more discussions, thoughtful questions. I will address questions from our fan mail. Like pot pardon in Canada. Might as well, do that one. Quickly. So in the US, President Biden is starting to pardon people convicted of cannabis-related violations or charges, whereas this does not seem to be happening in Canada. So the question was, why is it not happening? How important is it? I would say it is important because, again, was the law justified? Was the cannabis law justified for those many years? And the easiest comparison, of course, is alcohol. So it just seemed to be a double standard. And in terms of individual rights, again, that's the irony of living in a free country. You should have the right to harm yourself as long as you're not harming others. And so if drinking alcohol and consuming cannabis, even if it's harming you, you should be allowed to do it as long as you're not harming others. But how come that alcohol was legal and cannabis wasn't, right? So that was the problem. and so now that they've decriminalized cannabis, it would appear that they should follow through and pardon any convicted criminals, including my neighbor here and, of course, Mark Emery. But this still seems to be a minor point in the grand scheme of things compared to the other fires we're dealing with. But it does relate to the individual freedom to do as you please in a society as long as you're not harming others. Though now the government is so aggressively decriminalizing harder drugs that now I'm not so sure. So, for example, decriminalizing, so I think, was it Vancouver? And there's cities in California that are decriminalizing small amounts of harder drugs like cocaine, fentanyl, even morphine possibly. And I'm just not sure. Again, it's very complicated. And this relates to the safe injection sites that's been implemented for much longer. It just seemed, again, on the surface, it seems reasonable. Oh, you want to protect drug users from using dirty needles, but by providing them with free, clean needles and injection sites, aren't you encouraging a behavior that is damaging? So, it's a tough one. It's a tough one. Where, yeah, you want to protect individuals, you want to respect individual human rights. But what kind of message are you sending to young people by decriminalizing harder drugs? And again, where's the research? We need more long-term, carefully, rigorously done research. And that takes time and it's very expensive. So that's not even clear, like, who's going to pay for all of this. And so that's why less is more, right? So from a more traditional libertarian perspective, we just kind of stay out of things. So you would say, well, it's unclear what the long-term effects. The new one now is psychedelics, whether it's mushrooms, magic mushrooms, edibles, and even microdosing mushrooms claim that, all these intellectuals are now doing microdoses of magic mushrooms before going to work. And there seems to really be a big push towards normalizing these psychedelics. And in the Netherlands, they're even calling them smart drugs. Smart drugs. But, and again, people would have the freedom to do those drugs to their own detriment. But a libertarian or a smaller government approach would just try to say, let's just stay out of this. And we try to inform people about the risks, but we don't really have the resources to do multiple 10-year longitudinal studies to see if you microdose magic mushrooms to actually study the effects of microdosing and taking magic mushrooms every day in combination with cannabis and alcohol and all these other drugs, right? We don't really have the resources to study that. And if we don't, therefore, it's hard to inform people, right? So the government should take a more neutral approach to saying, you can try to do those drugs responsibly in moderation, but there are huge risks, and we need to study it, and we need to find rich philanthropists, I guess, that would be willing to study it carefully, rigorously, long term. Is being a conspiracy theorist a bad thing? Well, we covered that, but I just had an extra point that I wanted to add. So again, if you go to left-leaning biased Wikipedia, conspiracy theorist, you do get the valid, or in my opinion, the key distinction is that a conspiracy theorist, it chooses an explanation for an event or situation that invokes unlikely, sinister, powerful groups when other, more likely explanations exist. But my new follow-up point or new clarification is that, like, to determine whether an event, to determine the relative likelihood of what's causing an event, whether it's a more mundane, boring explanation or a more sinister, darker explanation, that requires independent thinking, independent, critical, careful, rigorous thinking. And as we saw in the COVID period, and still ongoing, is that just even questioning a little bit too much would get you accused of being a conspiracy theorist, including my own family. Well, not immediate family, but like a cousin's wife. And so that's a problem. And so maybe an example will clarify what I mean here. So in long time ago, this is like in the 60s, there were conspiracy theories against the FBI in the US. The conspiracy theory was that the military was hiding evidence of UFOs, right? And so that's what would be a conspiracy theory, because it was invoking kind of like, oh, all these people in the military are hiding evidence of UFOs, when in fact a more mundane explanation would be, well, the UFOs just don't exist, or the evidence is not credible enough to even bother talking about it. But fast forward 50 years later, this is like last year, the FBI and the US government did release, for the first time ever, new evidence that the military had about the existence of UFOs, which in my opinion is still not credible, right? But for the purpose of the example, is that conspiracy theory turned out to be true, right? And that, again, truth is very messy, and even in science, when you look at even the discovery of oxygen, it's actually very hard to pinpoint exactly when oxygen was discovered, because they didn't have very good measurement instruments. And so you actually had to make wild conjectures, wild theories with insufficient evidence before you keep debating and keep measuring observations more carefully, and eventually the truth emerges eventually. But it's generally very messy, and often the evidence can be not well articulated, or there's I think Richard Feynman described it, that the Mother Nature only gives you a few clues, and then you have to solve the puzzle. And Mother Nature is very good at only telling you enough to then be able to piece the pieces together. And so if you apply that to politics, it's the same thing. Politics is and the government is really, really messy organization of people with a lot of mixed motivations and a lot of conflict of interest. And so you're going to have evidence for misbehaviors, but maybe your evidence is insufficient at this current time, but because you're connecting the dots, it leads to the conjecture that something more sinister is going on. But it's going to take time for things to shake out and for the truth to emerge, right? And so what we really want to avoid aggressively accusing people of being conspiracy theorists when in fact, that's just generally the way that you get to the truth, is you need an unfettered exploration into the facts, and then you come up with theories that explain those facts, and then you go and test your theories, and then you have competing theories, right? And if you're not doing that, then again, this freedom of expression here is going to be stifled to the point where people are self-censoring. They're self-censoring their own thoughts, where, like we covered last time, you might have a thought entering your consciousness that, perhaps COVID vaccines are not safe. But then you remember, I don't want to be called a conspiracy theorist, so I'm just going to stay quiet. I'm not even going to tell my wife, right? And so now you're self-censoring, and that can lead to pluralistic ignorance, which is all of these people having private doubts about something, but because they don't speak up publicly or to their friends about it, then these scandals can fester and fester and get worse, and these scandals, these human rights violations, can continue unabated, even though there's large percentages of people that have private doubts, but they're just not speaking up. Okay, we have a comment. Very interesting discussions and topics covered. Thank you for your comment, Ian Scott, hailing from Yukon. And let me know if you have a question, a thoughtful question. But thanks. It's good to know. People are listening. People are out there. We've got some viewers. We just need more discussions, more visibility, more discussions. Okay, so that covers the... So to answer, is being a conspiracy theorist a bad thing? Well, it's not automatically a bad thing. Because again, the truth can be stranger than fiction. And part of discovering the truth is being wrong and being humble. So just like in science, if you are not willing to be wrong, then you're not going to be testing sufficiently different theories that could actually explain reality. And that's the exciting part of science, actually. And that's why I went into science, because it's actually... and I'm going to bring it up. It's Carl... What's his name? Carl Sagan. Science... Contradiction... Oh, where is it? Anyways, we'll find it. It's basically saying that science is the simultaneous holding of two contradictory attitudes. One is extreme open-mindedness to any and all ideas, no matter how bizarre they sound at first. But second, ruthless scrutiny of the evidence and arguments supporting those wild ideas. And it's both. You completely need both. And so you need to be both very creative, again, very creative with your theories, whether they're conspiratorial or not, but simultaneously really rigorous at what is the merit of the evidence. What are the merits of these arguments and the evidence supporting these wild ideas, right? So keep that in mind. Oh yeah, and it relates to even Einstein's quote that science is just common sense enhanced. It's an enhanced version of common sense. Oh, actually, I have it in one of my papers, the Daryl Bam papers, which is good to bring up. There you go, Carl Sagan. At the heart of science is an essential tension between two seemingly contradictory attitudes, an openness to new ideas no matter how bizarre or counterintuitive they may be, and the most ruthless skeptical scrutiny of all ideas old and new. This is how deep truths are winnowed from deep nonsense. And I just love that, right? And it's often, it captures or speaks to a misconception of science, that science is somehow this boring adventure or this boring quest to only stick to facts, and oh, that's not proven by science, and oh, I can't believe in other things, and it's not true. You can have really wild theories as a scientist, but then you have to state that, well, this is a crazy conjecture. This is a wild speculation that we're looking into, and we're combing through the evidence, and we're curating and distilling the evidence and looking to see if we can find confirmatory evidence, disconfirmatory evidence, and that's what we pointed out in this paper, that what was happening in psychology, there was not enough rigor in terms of this ruthless scrutiny of really checking and rechecking the work and reanalyzing the data and replicating the experiments and really trying to rule out the more boring explanations for getting positive results, which is generally that you just cherry pick your evidence, cherry pick the analyses, cherry pick the samples, which we were trained to do. Okay, so that's very thorough coverage of those questions, and keep them coming. So now we dive into 11 o'clock, the mandatory vaccines as violating medical ethics. And where should we go? Or, I mean, what screen? Maybe I'll just show the mountains here. Just for some eye candy. I'll pull up the Nuremberg Code and maybe the Hippocratic Oath. But this one, it doesn't actually have to be that deep of a dive. Because again, because so many governments have committed medical atrocities, whether you're talking about the Tuskegee experiments in the US, where they literally purposefully gave black patients syphilis to study the effects of syphilis. Of course, we have MK Ultra, where they were intentionally drugging people with LSD and torturing them and isolating them, including the Unabomber. We can get into that. So again, we have a very long track record of poor track record of governments and pharmaceutical companies, which are often just revolving door between high status individuals working for mega corporations and then working for political lobby groups and then actually working in government and so on. Think of Dick Cheney and Halliburton in the U.S., vice president of U.S., and then 5 years before that, he was chairman of the board of Halliburton, military equipment manufacturer. So, you know, that's the context. This is History 101, and I'm not a history expert or history buff, but all I remember from history class is that you need to know about history so that you can avoid repeating it. So again, even at the beginning of COVID, the default should be the default response should be skepticism, because governments have a lot of power, and it's already very well documented that they often are abusing their power and using excessive power. And in Canada, I guess a better example would be the residential schools and the torture and the cruel treatment of Indigenous children, including pretty dark claims, or not claims, I mean, dark crimes of child abuse. And there were some pastors involved there too, I guess, and the teachers. And then, of course, the mistreatment of Japanese, mistreatment of Chinese, working on the railroad, So again, it's completely irresponsible to just fast forward to 2022 and say, no, it's impossible. The government is coming in crimes now, and the Freedom Convoy protesters must be extremist white supremacists, right? I mean, you have to have an open mind and look at the history. And you don't need a far-fetched conspiracy theory to connect the dots and say pharmaceutical companies just want to make more money. The COVID vaccine is literally the largest vaccine rollout in history of the world. So the stakes are higher, so your scrutiny and your skepticism should be higher, right? And somehow all of these discussions are just thrown out the window, and they just attack you with emotional ad hominem attacks. And so that's the broader context in looking into why the Nuremberg Code is so important. Medical ethics that were designed and implemented to prevent medical torture in the future. Okay, let's bring this back up. Where is it? Okay. Excuse me. And maybe we will cover the 10 points. Excuse me. So as we reviewed last time, the key component, and this is in grad school, we were trained carefully. Whenever we ran psychology experiments, we had to submit like 10 pages minimum, trying to convince the ethics board at the university that our experiment was not violating any ethical principles, but that the experiment would yield fruitful results. So to even conduct an experiment, it has to be set up that the probability of learning something useful is high, because you don't want to just manipulate an experiment on humans for no good reason. And this includes human experimentation or even animal experimentation. And the experiment should be conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering. And this is where we were relevant to us, because we were studying sensitive topics like racial bias, embarrassing social situations, dating, admitting to, unsavory behaviors, attitudes towards other groups. And so there was often a discussion as to, for example, you're gonna ask participants to remember stealing or remember a time where you did something unethical. And the ethics board would say, well, do you really need to ask this? Because maybe if they recall something unethical, it's gonna stick with them and they're gonna be traumatized and they're gonna start obsessing, right? So we had to just explain what the safeguards were and how these risks were minimal. And so on. But as you can see, these are very strict. No experiment should be conducted where there's an a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. And that's very interesting, because I remember in the fall of 2020 when they started talking about COVID vaccines as the only solution to the end of the pandemic, I would say, well, the solution is simple. Get the politicians to take the vaccine first, and if they're all survive, right, then we can consider taking it. But that would rest on the assumption, of course, that they are taking the real vaccine, which is now in contention itself. I haven't looked into it. There's claims in France that Macron and all his other elected officials may not have taken the real thing. But I haven't looked into that. And the degree of risk to be taken should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved. Proper preparations to protect the subjects. Experiments should only be conducted by scientifically qualified persons. Highest degree of skill and care through all stages of the experiment. I mean, basically, the drug companies have violated almost all of these. Particularly Pfizer. Oh yeah, and you must be prepared to terminate the experiment early if there's probable cause to believe that the humans are being harmed. And if anything, the COVID vaccine rollout is basically an experiment, because even though the stage 3 clinical trials were conducted on over 35,000 people, that's still a small sample compared to millions and millions of people that, like in the US, I mean, it's hundreds of millions. And so the experiment is still ongoing in a sense, because even with 30,000 people sample, they didn't have pregnant people, they didn't have other immunocompromised people, they didn't have children, right? So it's still basically the proper experiment is the broader rollout, and then they are legally required to track safety signals for a follow-up period, but somehow the CDC and these meetings, they're just ignoring the safety signals. But again, we need to focus on the first one, which is the most important, which is informed consent, voluntary consent, which means you have to be able to, once you are told about all known risks and benefits of participating in an experiment or of taking a medical treatment, you must be free to choose whether you want to participate or not. But of course, if the context makes it so that you cannot choose freely and think clearly for yourself, then that would be a violation of ethics. And for example, you may not believe this. So in our experiments in psychology, most students were undergrad students who would participate for course credit. But some of our experiments, they would be paid. So we would offer $10 for a half an hour study, or even maybe an hour study. And, but of course, if you offer more money, then you get more participants. But what turned out is that we were not allowed to offer too much money, because that would be considered coercion. And I remember at first being kind of confused by that, because it just seemed like small amount. It didn't seem like they were splitting hairs. Like, really? Like, how could it be that bad to offer $50 for like a 10-minute survey? But the logic is that when you offer too much money, that people cannot think clearly. And so they're more likely to choose to participate in a dangerous, risky medical or dangerous study. Right? But again, pharmaceutical companies routinely will offer hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for people to participate in their dangerous, risky experiments. And somehow that's allowed to happen? So again, why are the universities subjected to extremely, if anything, overly strict ethical oversight, ethics clearance? It's called Human Subjects Ethics Clearance Review Board, IRB board. How come universities are constrained by such strict ethics rules, whereas these mega corporations don't need to comply to those strict rules? And even actually Hollywood and TV reality shows, often, that was my counter-argument. These TV reality shows would do experiments and use deception on the people and film at the same time. So that was another, seemed to be a violation. But But again, they have loopholes. They have like a disclaimer. You can get people to sign something. Or again, you just don't consider it an experiment. So then it becomes about splitting hairs and linguistic tricks, like what is happening in the public inquiry of the Emergencies Act. So they could say, well, it's a TV reality show. It's not an experiment, right? But in fact, the TV reality show could be set up like an experiment where people are randomly paired together, the Survivor Man or Naked and Afraid. So it follows, and this is brief again. If you're threatening people's jobs if they don't get a medical treatment that is arguably unnecessary, then that is just unambiguously a violation of medical ethics. And if anything, even if it was, even if, again, the COVID vaccine was actually effective and safe, and the coronavirus was actually significantly more dangerous to the general population, even then, it would be a violation of medical ethics to threaten someone's job. So, and of course, you could try to think of other situations like Ebola, like if you have an infection fatality rate of 20%, but even these numbers, 20 to 30%, that's coming from African samples where healthcare is compromised or not as well functioning. But for the sake of the example, even in the case of more deadly viruses, it would still be very, very tricky to justify the medical ethics of forcing vaccination, right? Forced vaccination of involuntarily, or to force vaccination against someone's will. It would still be extremely difficult to justify. But that's the only one I could see that would possibly be justified. But again, the evidence would have to be much stronger in terms of actually showing that the vaccine actually works and prevents infection and transmission. And now another scandal is in the European Parliament. A Dutch member, they were cross-examining Pfizer employee, where even the Pfizer employee admitted, yeah, the COVID vaccine was never tested, whether it prevents transmission. Well, if that's the case, then how could they justify that you need to be vaccinated to keep your job? But the counterpoint is, and the pharmaceutical companies will say, well, we don't have the resources to do that proper study, which is invalid. And actually, even for their initial clinical trials submitted to governments for approval, emergency use approval, that's also their argument, is that, well, the standards can't be too high because then they don't have the resources, therefore they can't actually produce and manufacture life-saving medications, right? So, but it's a catch-22, and it's a contradiction of, again, medical ethics, the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. Like, those are so important. Like, it doesn't matter how expensive it is. You need the evidence. You need proper evidence that a medical treatment is safe and effective, no matter how much it costs. And if it costs a lot of money, right? Like you just need that evidence. It's a non-optional. It's a non-optional requirement, because without proper evidence, you don't actually know. So you can't just say, "Oh, no, trust us on this." And in this case, the mRNA technology is brand new. So that's the other wrinkle we haven't really talked about. This is the first time they roll out non-traditional vaccines where there's a kind of messenger RNA that sends a message to your body to produce the antibodies. And they'd been trying to achieve that for 10 years unsuccessfully. So that was also suspicious as to, and that's why early on in the pandemic, people were saying like, no, don't hold your breath for these companies to be able to produce a COVID vaccine, because they've been trying unsuccessfully in the respiratory illness area, even for SARS, SARS-1. And then all of a sudden, oh, actually, no, it's working. Yeah. Oh, yeah, we have the evidence. And let's rush through the emergency use approval. And it was really surprising because, again, they had never achieved this, even with traditional vaccine, never mind with a brand new mechanism, the mRNA route. And so, if anything, the government should have demanded even higher evidence or stronger evidence. They should have demanded longer term, not less, right? So they lowered the bar for the emergency use authorization of the COVID vaccines, when in fact they should have raised the bar, because it's the first time they use mRNA technology. But I guess because people were so burnt out and tortured and fatigued from all the lockdowns, and they just wanted their life to go back to normal, and they had all this fear conditioning and all the, right? Because of that context, people were just a bit more open to taking a rushed experimental vaccine, I guess. And again, all the censorship and the trying to prevent people from speaking up and bringing up these issues and concerns, that also helped. Okay, so that's the deep dive. And again, how could it possibly not be? So that's the other way to look at it. It's, I'll go back. So again, can anyone think of, like, how would demanding mandatory COVID vaccine or else you lose your job, how could that ever possibly be argued to not be a medical ethics violation just by reading the Nuremberg Code, right? Maybe you just redefine the word experiment. You say, well, this is not an experiment, but it is an experiment. Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. I will abstain from all intentional wrongdoing and harm. So they could argue, well, it's unintentional. Okay, here's what was used, or in medical, U.S. medical schools. Yeah. I don't think it's worth reading. Helsinki Declaration is another one. Right to self-determination, the right to make informed decisions regarding participation in research, both initially and during the course of the research. Well, you can also go to the Canadian, I think I've done the Canadian Medical Association. Or no, the Canadian. Which clearly have been infiltrated. Let's see if, like, where are their ethics? Right, our focus. Anyways, we'll get back to that. because in some of our documents, we even showed how the Canadian Medical Association was violating their own ethics. And it is curious, actually. Their website seems different. But to me, ethics should be front and center. So this is actually even curious that, like, from their nav bar, like, you know, they should have ethics front and center. So this is already pretty curious. But again, maybe they just changed it. Oh, here you go. So I had to click our focus, policies and research, and then ethics and medical professionalism. Oh dear. Vaccine equity, like patient safety. So here's some feedback for their website. Put the ethics code of conduct for all doctors front and center. What about, I think there's the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. Is another one where they should have policies, practice guide, values, principles of medical practice. Because again, they are responsible, and if they violate these, then they need to be investigated. Professional competence, conflict of interest. What version? Refreshed 2021. So this would be interesting. Oops. I don't know if you can see that you could compare the 2007 version with the refreshed 2021 version to see what has changed. And really, in general, you're supposed to have a list of what changed between versions of the documents. But trustworthiness. All right. I think we need another break. Yeah, and it's supposed to be patient-centered. So this was the other curiosity with the COVID measures and the COVID vaccines, is that for decades we've been told about patient-centered healthcare and how the patient it should be more at the center of medical decisions, and the doctor being just, the doctor gives his best judgment to what could treat you and help you with your health, but the patient is the one ultimately making the decision. And even a doctor cannot force a patient to take a medical treatment, except in very, very extenuating circumstances. So I think one example is like if someone's kind of like on a hunger strike or bulimic or anorexic. Yeah, there are extenuating circumstances where if it's life and death, a doctor would be justified in forcing a treatment to save the person's life. Right, that's very, very extreme. Yeah, this seems... There you go. A physician must always act in the patient's best interest. And any conflict of interest must be properly managed as to not compromise patient's best interests or be avoided. Personal advantage, financial or otherwise, at the expense of the patient. I think they should be forced to be more transparent about the conflict, and the conflict of interest should be right on their doctor's door. Because this is too vague. Ensure that patient's best interests remain paramount, and where appropriate, disclose the conflict of interest to the patient. What? Like, you don't have time for that. It should be right on the wall, right on the door, right, like, front and center. Participate in self-regulation. They should educate themselves. Yeah, they should be informed. Again, it's your job. If you're going to recommend the COVID vaccine, it's your job to really be informed and to look at all the evidence, all credible, valid evidence from all different perspectives. And that's not happening. And this both based on systematic evidence, systemic evidence, and anecdotal evidence of just dealing with just so many bad doctors who are just, they can barely speak English. Never mind being competent at their job. Okay, so that's enough. Take a quick break and we'll be right back.
2 million people behind me.
Right.
But these few anti-vaxxers.
And disheveled a bit, and maybe the hair is in the wind, is up all over the place, and you know, people who search you for.
Take the most radical person to portray the masses. You know, you can take reasoning away.
Yeah. Okay.
Only if it paints your picture you're trying to portray. Yeah. I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah,
in Canada, we didn't even have the pictures. They just used the names and the labels and said the entire group is.
Be right back.
We didn't even have the disheveled or the radical or even a video of some crazy talk. I think the closest we got would have been, and sorry if you're listening and you don't like this, but maybe Pat King's rhetoric was a little bit close to the line. But that would be it. You know, that'd be it. He wasn't talking about doing things that would get him in too much trouble. But that was about it. So globally, Canada would be supported if we did it again. Yeah, and
when I was on Twitter, I mean, the feeds were just full, basically, of people sharing so much, because there wasn't just one person sharing footage. There was numerous groups, but that's all it was. And of course, Twitter doesn't like it, so people then start getting banned all over. You had a little bit on Facebook, but again, you know, it would be very controlled. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to it, because at the end of the day, if you don't get what you wanted out of this inquiry, then it's just going to push forward, because what's coming down the pipe next is, okay, if you look at the bigger picture, you know, did you see there's a story in Oxford in this country that they want to ban cars from moving outside of their borough, basically for a large part of the year. So you'd only be allowed out of your area for 100 days a year. And they're actually going to trial that in Oxford. Mm-hmm. They're going to split the city into 6 different boroughs, districts. I mean, what? That's bad. But that's all part of that climate green agenda.
Yeah, and I think where they're headed with that is autonomous vehicles and vehicles as a service. They don't want people to own vehicles. They're headed towards vehicles as a service, like the subscription Uber type of thing, where if you just need a car, you'll order a car and it'll take you there, but you don't own a car. That's where
if you have a carbon account, which everybody would be supposedly forced to have, you wouldn't still then be allowed to, because your phone would say, well, sorry, but you're not going anywhere today.
Oh, for sure. And it's all about being able to control transportation and the movement of people. If we transition into cars as a service, you know, on its face sounds great until they decide to shut it off. And then what do? We don't have a car anymore. So it may seem economically, because they're going to do the whole economic spin, and it fits right into the you'll own nothing and be happy mantra. Because you don't own the car.
You thought it was just weird, but the more that goes on, you start to look at things a little bit deeper, and you think, wow.
Yeah, and can you imagine that button on their side? We're going to do a lockdown because of whatever. Oh, well, stop the cars. All right, no more transportation. You can't even order the car. Well, what about food? Well, we'll deliver food, but you're not allowed to use the vehicle.
All right, we're back. It's already 11:30. It's crazy how time flies. So we're going to start wrapping up into our ad lib spontaneous commentary on the other topics, which we promised. So I'm kind of forced to cover them. Don't want to be charged with Misleading advertising. Okay, how do I click that? Okay, so we'll go back. I guess they're on a break. And let's see here. So we had new Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. Do I want to pull her up? She's making all kinds of pronouncements that just seem a bit too, just seems a bit too good to be true. Okay. So we already reviewed that, or in the last time, that she's saying she's going to add a new Minister of Health. Or no, he's not going to add Minister of Health. It's going to add a separate team to help manage the situation instead of firing and actually investigating Dr. Hinshaw, who was responsible for actually implemented the COVID vaccine mandates, which Jason Kenney said would never happen. And so again, when you look at this politician who've not been elected by the people, by the way, she was elected by her party, the United Conservative Party of Alberta. But nonetheless, a career politician who has all kinds of ties to establishment. So she's saying a lot of good things. And for example, she's also saying Alberta should have their own police, like the OPP, Ontario Provincial Police. We should have the Alberta Provincial Police. And but we'll see, because it just seems like empty promises. And Jason Kenney was able to say, well, we're definitely not going to have COVID vaccine mandates in Alberta. And then 3 months later, well, we may have to have COVID vaccine mandates. And then 3 months later, we are going to have COVID vaccine mandates. Right? And so we will be looking deeper into Danielle Smith and her pronouncements. So here's, well, I can even show it. This is if you just go to her own Twitter feed. Freedom of the individual, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom to act in your own interest, liberty is at the heart of it. Calgary Sun, I'm not for turning. Against carbon tax increase. New cabinet. Well, it's a new cabinet, but isn't it all the same people? We'll no longer ask permission from Ottawa to be prosperous and free. So I'm skeptical. But we will see. And next time I will get some more concrete details that support my skepticism. Even though, again, I want to hear this I want to hear good news. I'm desperate. I'm a desperate optimist. I'm desperately looking for good news. But as an intellectual, you have to be careful when you are seeing something that you want to see. You have to still really carefully examine, let's see here. Okay. Carefully examine the evidence. Because just because you want something to be true, that means you are going to be even more, like humans are generally biased to see what they want to see. But now if you have an extra motivation because you've been hammered for over 2 years, right, then you have to still be vigilant. And that's why being an intellectual, being a critical thinker is so difficult. Okay, so what was the other point? The final point was be wary of false hope. And to me, the fact that she didn't change any cabinet members from Kenny, who, again, committed probably the most un-Albertan things in Alberta's history, those people should be scrutinized. They should be held to account, especially Dr. Hinshaw, who should be investigated for medical ethics violations. And so again, that tells you, well, like you either care about medical ethics or you don't, right? You can't have it both ways. And so the fact that she's pronouncing all these magical things to make Alberta great again, those do not concord with her other decisions to not go with a completely new cabinet of people with actually higher ethics. And so moving on to the next story, this one is also this is a story about Ottawa Police Detective Helen Grus. I'll bring this up here. This is from Donald Best, who is a retired Toronto police chief or main detective. And so the story is that back in February 4th, she was suspended with pay for conducting investigations into the sudden deaths of 9 infants, where she sought to know the vaccine status of the mothers. So she was apparently trying to investigate whether there was any link between a mother being vaccinated, COVID vaccinated, and then having their infant suddenly die from SIDS, sudden death infant syndrome. And the new development is that she is now ordered back to work. So this is October 11th, which seems very curious. And her hearing is adjourned till December 6th. But this seems surprising because, again, if she's actually guilty of anything, why would she be allowed to go back to work? So it suggests and is more consistent with the possibility that the Ottawa police suspended her for political reasons rather than actual valid reasons. And again, this would serve a chilling effect among other police, because again, this has been a big mystery of Randy Hillier and all these other lawyers and human rights lawyers submitting evidence to police of even last early fall of what seemed to be a disproportionate number of young, healthy individuals dying suspiciously with potential links to the COVID vaccine. And I haven't seen any investigations into that. And because again, the police, under the Police Services Act, there's very specific standards as to if the public brings evidence to the police of crimes taking place, the police are required to investigate, or at least to begin an investigation and have a file number. And even Randy Hillier claims that he brought this to the attention of police, local police that he knows, and he claims that none of the police officers were comfortable bringing it to the attention of their supervisors for fear of reprisal or for fear that they would lose their job. But to me, if you're really that confident in these allegations, you should do the right thing, and you should defend principles above your own job. Because what's the point of having a job if people are literally being injured from an experimental vaccine that appears to be unnecessary for the vast majority of individuals? Right? And it is tough. But again, if we start violating these principles, then society can derail very quickly. But this story, we will track it closely because there still seem to be a lot of missing details. So, for example, a skeptical take here is, so she's an investigator. Her job is to investigate possible crimes, and but it's unclear. You have deaths of 9 infants. So her job is to investigate, and the police work with coroner's office, where they do autopsies to try to determine the cause of death. Was there any foul play? But one thing that's unclear here is it says she sought to know the vaccine status of the mothers. Well, what do you mean? Like, of course, the mothers, we have privacy laws where your medical status on whether you took certain medications or vaccines, that is private information. So, but clearly as a detective, she knows about privacy laws. So presumably, but this is something we want to rule out, presumably she is not violating privacy laws here. So how is it discreditable conduct? And so we would have to look into, well, what exactly is her role as a detective for the Ottawa Police? And did she violate any privacy laws? And if not, then this is just a political stunt. Right, but and again, the chances that she would violate privacy laws is so low, because if she did, then they would get her on that. I mean, that would be a valid reason to suspend her, and that's what they would want. They would want to be able to say, oh, we're because it could still serve their political purpose, but just be a more compelling suspension. And apparently she now has a new lawyer, human rights lawyer. So we will follow this story because, again, this is important for the broader context of not dissuading other police detectives that might be onto this story, right? And again, people should be unfettered to look into the truth. What is the truth? What are the facts in terms of COVID vaccines potentially injuring young individuals? Whether it's the pericarditis, myocarditis in teenagers, young individuals, or now this potential association between sudden infant death syndrome and maternal vaccination, I guess. So that's that story. And yeah. So the final story is, let's see here. Fan mail, where the person, and I'm very appreciative of this feedback, like any feedback. Oh, we got a comment. We've been hoodwinked again. What time is it? We've been hoodwinked again. 11:22. Oh, sorry, I missed your comment. So I'm actually not sure what that was in reference to, but thanks for the comments. I do need to be better at, maybe there's a sound or a way for me to get a notification bell. I need to be more prompt at noticing that we have a message. So sorry about that, but we will work on that. So the last story is this fan mail. And again, really appreciate all the feedback, including negative feedback of things I can better explain, use better diagrams. But in this case, there was a suggestion that I should avoid polarizing topics such as gun control and abortion, though we had not planned on covering abortion, but it could be more relevant later, I guess. But of course, the gun control is on the list down over here. And so that's the question becomes, why, with the goal of our show to strengthen democracy through long-form analysis, civil debates, and watchdog journalism, why would you want to avoid polarizing topics? Well, because they're unpleasant. They're emotional. They're unpleasant. People get riled up. They have more difficulty thinking clearly. But that's part and parcel of our challenge, is to help people have these difficult discussions with their families and friends. Because again, if we don't feel comfortable having these discussions into very complicated matters, then I think that's a dangerous direction for society, right? And again, so we all, and actually this is a good point to remember. We could try to cover what are ways, and I discussed this yesterday with one of my neighbors, is to actually discuss specific strategies to use when discussing these heated, polarizing topics. And so very quickly, you can, if you notice the person becoming heated or emotional, you can try to just pivot slightly to de-escalate things and then try finding common ground, right? So when you have a discussion about a topic, a polarizing topic, you of course, how do I do these gesticulations? So you have points of disagreement, but then what you can do is try to find common ground. So you kind of pivot the discussion to, let's find some common ground where we both agree, and then the disagreement point is over here. How can we get closer to the point of disagreement to get back to a more constructive discussion? And even for myself, I mean, I've been paid to debate, and I spent way too long in university where that's all you're doing. Grad school is basically, you just wake up and you go and you debate and discuss ideas, and you present papers and presentation and data, and you debate and you go to class and you go teaching and you go to conferences. And even for me, this took a while because in the moment, you have to be very quick on your feet of, okay, the person's saying this, and now their emotions are bubbling up, and now people are flustered. So you really have to practice. Social skill, it takes a lot of practice to remain calm and remain in the moment and just very gracefully pivoting, and then in the back of your mind saying, okay, let's try to find common ground. Let's try to find common ground and pivot the discussion to, in the case of gun control, for example, you could try to say, okay, you're against guns for self-defense, but like, what would be a situation where you would support the ability of people to use weapons to self-defense? So for example, you could say, well, what about a knife? See, a kitchen knife can be used as a weapon in self-defense. So do you agree with that, right? And hopefully the person says yes. And then you say, okay, now we have common ground to get back on to our original discussion, right? So now, okay, we both agree that in an extreme situation where a mother's at home with their children and there's an intruder, she grabs the cleaver, she grabs the biggest kitchen knife possible. So we can agree on that. And then you move on back towards the original point of disagreement. So yeah, I'm gonna write this down and we can try to cover this and just go through more examples, and we can even, abortion is even more polarizing, I realize, especially when the people involved have gone through an abortion. So yeah, that's the ultimate challenge, I guess. Tries for civilized, constructive discussion. Okay, and lastly, constructive discussion. Lastly, avoid targeting individual elected officials. So in my graph, of course, I have the word government, but I also have the word Trudeau. And the suggestion was like, well, maybe you can avoid targeting individuals. And I got that in grad school all the time, where I'm criticizing a journal editor for a journal policy that seems to contradict basic principles of science. And I write a blog post and I use his name because that's the journal editor. And I was told, don't target individuals. And that didn't make sense. Well, he's the editor of the journal. He has the powerful position. He or she needs to be held accountable and scrutinized. I mean, a journal editor is a very powerful person. They can affect whether you get a publication and therefore get a professorship job. And it's the same here. Why would we want to avoid using Trudeau's name when he's the commander-in-chief? And of course, he has a team of people that also should be held responsible. But again, we cannot have a true, free, and democratic society if we don't have individual responsibility, right? These people have power over other individuals' lives. Therefore, with power comes responsibility, and their responsibility is, or for them to be held responsible and accountable, they need to be scrutinized at a heightened level, which includes using their name and saying they approved this legislation, or they invoked this order in council to ban assault-style rifles. He did it, and he has a team, but they're individuals. Because if we get away from the notion of individual responsibility and accountability, then it's a dangerous path again. Because again, the government's just a collection of individuals. The individuals have to be responsible to be meeting all medical ethics violations, meeting the law, not breaking the law, not breaking the criminal code, right? It's individuals. All of these individuals that work together in government, they are all individually accountable to not violating the rule of law, not violating medical ethics code of conduct, not violating political, there's strict ethics code of conduct for elected officials. But again, thanks for the feedback, but that's my 2 cents. And I think we will wrap it up here. Next time, we will dig into this chart, and we will dig into these other developments that suggest that Canada's vital organs in terms of these 6 fundamental categories, there are concerning authoritarian flavored developments in each of these 6 vital categories, and this is what makes these developments more concerning. But there's hope. We're joining forces with other independent journalists and lawyers, and we will play more music to soothe our souls and nurture our souls. So with that, thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time.